So please welcome Elizabeth.
For all the high-tech people in the room, I'm leveling the playing field because this is my first ever PowerPoint presentation. All right, and I'm reading this. So, the American city is changing rapidly, yet the way we plan for our land use and how we use our planning models is not really evolving with our emerging urban landscape. So our old models are really not meeting our new needs. Baltimore is among many cities that have lost a significant percentage of its residents. We have nearly 400,000 fewer people here than in 1950. This population loss, coupled with our shift from an industrial, port-centric economy, has changed the geography of our city. We have an epidemic of vacant houses, underutilized properties, abandoned sites, and what's known as the missing teeth in the row house. So what do we want the future Baltimore to look like? How can we as citizens begin to interact with this new geography and advocate for what we need, whether it's more public space, a red line, better sidewalks, access to the water or public parks, or some way to use our vacant land? There is an emerging trend in the country that I've dubbed urban interaction. Citizens are taking to the streets in creative ways to question policies and impact change. So I'm going to take you on a tour. We're going to start in Detroit. Now in Detroit, they've lost 50% of their population. There was a small group of artists that decided they wanted to bring attention to the fact that 7,000 buildings were now abandoned. So they went out in the wee small hours of the night and they started painting city-owned properties bright orange. And the effect was staggering. It got a lot of media attention, but more importantly, it spurred the city planning agencies to address the dilapidated buildings that they owned. Now in downtown San Francisco, they have a different percent of the outdoor space dedicated to the private vehicle, and there's not a lot of public space. A group known as Rebar created an intervention called Parking Day. What they did was they paid a city meter, effectively leasing the land for the day, and then they shipped in sod, and they brought in park benches, and they brought in trees, and they created a park where the parking spot was, and they invited everybody to stop by and sit on the park benches. So it was wildly successful, and now the Trust for Public Land, which is a national nonprofit organization, is underwriting this in cities across the country. It just happened in September, and over 80 cities participated. So it brings up an interesting question. How public is our public space? In the American city, we often have areas that are technically public, but they feel less than inviting. Maybe it's because of private management, rent-a-cops, blue blinking lights, or just a simple lack of use and bad design. Imagine, for example, if you did your morning yoga routine around the public space around the harbor, what the cops would say about that. So permanent breakfast is a way to test the validity of public spaces. One person invites others to join them for an outdoor breakfast in an underutilized spot. It provokes people to use places considered off-limits and ask, well, why don't we use them better? It also brings us back into these common areas and reminds us that cities are places of interaction, and for that reason, one or more seats is always left open for someone who's passing by. A group that calls themselves Common Space asked the question, well, what happens when we start to lose true public space? How does that impact the messy vitality of the urban experience? A common practice in cities is to create these hybrid forms of common areas, often called privately owned public spaces. They can take the form of lobbies, atriums, outdoor courtyards, and promenades. Common space holds events in these spaces to push the limits and see how public they really are. This one is called a nappening, and it happens in a bank lobby. They've also hosted yoga classes, read-ins, headstand, and hula hoop competitions. In one case, a rent-a-cop tried to kick them out, and the real police were called in. The police had to admit that, in fact, it was a public space, and they were allowed to continue their peaceful demonstration. So speaking of public space, what about public food? A group called Fallen Fruit believes we should be able to shop the city. They've mapped all the free fruit available in Los Angeles and began advocating for more public fruit parks. And it's a really valuable reminder that most pre-industrial cities actually supported common areas for grazing, animals, farming, and fishing. Now, guerrilla gardening is something that's happening everywhere. It's worldwide. You find a blighted spot, you go out at night with some native species, and you plant. Here are some before and after shots of a median strip. And this raises a broader idea of what about reintroducing farms into our urban centers? What if some of these big, vacant, empty lots that we have in our city actually become our own little natural farmers market? Another city that does something really interesting with all of their abandoned space is Cleveland. This is called Pop-Up City, and they host events, temporary events, in vacant spots. So they'll have dog parks, markets. This is called the Bazaar Bazaar. It's like all the crafters come together, and they happen in places where there's normally no foot traffic, and it gets people to remember that the city is there and that they should use it. So now it's your turn. What do you want to do? If anyone is interested in engaging in an urban interaction in Baltimore, come see me. And anyone interested in talking more about design in the built environment in Baltimore should come to the Wind Up Space the first Wednesday of every month for the Design Baltimore Conversations.